All right. Welcome back to another episode of Exit Liquidity. Episode 80, I believe. Nice round number. This week we got Devin and Ed from Valantis. Thanks for joining us, guys.
GM.
Yo,
GM. Yeah, we've been excited for this one. Lots of cool stuff you guys are working on, some of which we understand and most of which we don't. So hopefully we can clear that up today. Yeah, thanks again for coming on. To start out, we love to just hear a little bit about kind of who you guys are. Doesn't have to be super crypto specific, just kind of what brought you to, coming on with us, what brought you to being here today, how you ended up building Valantis in the first place. Devin, you want to give us a little shout?
yeah, sure. I guess I kind of knew about Bitcoin probably maybe starting in 2013, but I was just like, oh, this is cool. That was it. Um, I kind of like dove a lot deeper into Ethereum in like 2018. For some reason, I thought it was a good idea not to buy any, but to like try to mine it. So I was in like high school at the time, and I was just like, yeah, let me just like turn on my computer. This is cool. Didn't really know like what I was mining at all. Um, Realized that I was extremely uncompetitive and I wasn't making any money. Yeah, I was doing like aerospace stuff at the time. Went to college, forgot about crypto for a bit, and then like 2020, things started going crazy again. I guess I started like paying a lot more attention, but at the same time, like not really doing anything properly about it. Just like, oh, this stuff is cool. It seems like it'll be around for a while. Seems like there's a number that's going up. Um, yeah, it wasn't until I met some other like kids at Berkeley that were doing like crypto related stuff. Some people that were doing like MEV related stuff. I ended up just helping them out. Didn't really even know what MEV strategies were at the time, but I started looking at get code. Um, Started to think that the execution layer was like really cool. Ended up joining like a student organization, blockchain at Berkeley, where like uh, yeah, I started like mostly still kind of thinking about execution clients, but they have this like governance kind of initiative that was getting started, where basically like the university was participating in like DeFi governance, and I was like, yeah, I care about politics a little bit. Like, let me kind of like see what this is about. I don't really understand applications that much. Decentralized finance seems like a pretty good value pitch, so started digging into like protocols like Aave, Uniswap, Compound, DYDX. Just started digging on governance forums a lot. Yeah, it was a lot of very social data that kind of goes around into running these things, and then I realized like, oh my goodness, like these billion-dollar lending markets are just like being managed by people that are like post on the forum like, hey, we should have this collateral factor, and everyone just kind of votes on it. And yeah, I mean, it was an interesting kind of thing. I did that for about 2 years. Got very, I think, yeah, I mean, at this point, I was just like, I'm not doing aerospace anymore. I'm not doing robotics. Like, I'm just kind of like had gotten like way too deep into crypto, but got a bit kind of scared of the application layer. So after I graduated school, I started working at Nethermind. I was like, I don't want to think about applications at all. I do not know how any of this ties back to users. It makes no sense. I just want to focus on like the core tech and like hide behind that. So yeah, I was working at Nethermind when I was an intern. I was like working on a StarkNet execution client, just like very basic like data type storage and things like that. Not like implementing VMs, but yeah, it was pretty cool. I still was like, I want to be an ETH protocol dev. I was still kind of watching all the stuff going on in governance, and I was like, this is a shit show. Um, I met Ed in July 2022, and he basically was like, yo, we can do better than this. Yeah, like these protocols that exist, like they're not really built in the right way. They're not as accommodating. It's so hard to build something new, especially in EVM. We can make it a lot easier. Yeah, and that was like July 2022. We've been like working on this ever since then. And yeah, just kind of wrapping my headspace around this very large space of decentralized exchanges since then, and haven't really looked back since.
Good stuff. Yeah. Before we jump over to Ed, I'm curious. There was a couple of different like early factors there with governance and DeFi. Did you have like a light bulb moment at any point? And if so, like what was that?
Yeah. Um, I think it's when I realized that Aave requires like $1 million contracts to be able to set and govern its risk parameters that I was like, I feel like there has to be better implementation. Then you look into like, more autonomous like lending markets, and they exist, and there's a lot more in DeFi. But I started to just kind of realize like why, like even if there are better solutions that exist, or not saying that there really are, but like it just seemed like a very incumbent run game. And there wasn't really much reason for someone to do something different because like you're sitting on giant protocol treasury, things kind of work. You just kind of pay other people to run the thing for you. Um, I don't know. I felt like it became very clear that like the stickiness around all of this stuff was maybe kind of hurting us from an innovation standpoint. And yeah, that's like it took a lot of convincing for me to be like, okay, yeah, like modular DeFi is a really good idea, but like will people actually care about it? Can we actually do things that will people care about? Because I'm watching and it's like people are saying cool stuff, people are releasing cool research papers, but like we're still sitting here with the same like V3 at the time. Like no one's really building anything new, and people that try to build something new, people are telling them it's a bad idea. Um, so I think like my kind of light bulb moment was just like figuring out how slow this stuff runs, how inefficient it is, how much overspending and stuff that like goes into DAOs in general. Um, but yeah, I mean, I will say that there was a, I mean, obviously I did it for like 2 years. I have a lot of like great things to say about the idea of these like protocols that run by themselves, and decentralized governance I actually do think works in certain respects. And you see the differences in models like, yeah, for example, like Aave just really has all of like 3 or 4 large players that kind of run governance, but I think that's okay. Like they all have different, they're not related entities legitimately, in my opinion. Like they have different, like they're all just have one common goal. It's like make Aave do well. And it works. Like there's like multiple entities that are developing the protocol in separate ways. Um, yeah, I think like when I started reading Rune's Endgame, I was like, I have no idea what's going on anymore. Like I kind of need to step away from this. My brain hurts. Um, but yeah, in general, I still watch kind of the governance space very closely and seeing how things are playing out. I'm excited for us to kind of do our take on it when when it's time to like pass the protocol off to the community. Um, but yeah, just I had a lot of deep fascination and then a deep like this is way too much. I need to turn my brain off from this and bury my head for a while, which is good. I feel way more refreshed than I did during those times.
Yeah, yeah, that's good to hear. That's interesting. I guess like looking into with what's available on Valantis. I mean, there's a little bit on your profile of it, but the I guess like governance heavy mindset isn't super like apparent from the socials. So definitely going to be good to like get into that today. Ed, what about you, man? What brought you here today? What's your story?
Sure. Um, Actually, I didn't know I would be in crypto probably until early 2021. I spent most of my time doing stuff in AI, mostly in academia, a bit in different industries as well. But honestly, like the first time I heard even the words Ethereum and Bitcoin was just about the bull mania of 2021. Like even everyone on the news was just talking about it. So to an outsider like me, I was like, okay, like what's Ethereum? What's a blockchain? And then like you just start to read about it for the first time, and I was like, okay, these might look interesting. Maybe I'll just buy some ETH and some BTC on a centralized exchange. And next thing you know, you're on Uniswap, and like as a user, like it's horrible UX. I was using MetaMask at the very beginning, but then you very quickly realize like, okay, I'm just buying this meme coin that it cost me more in gas than what I actually got out of the meme coin. So then you start to look, okay, are gas fees that expensive? And then you just land on BSC or Polygon or the chains. So it was a pretty interesting experience, like just randomly interacting with apps, starting with Uniswap. Then I didn't really know much about the tech behind it. I knew there was a lot of rugs. We can get into that in a sec, but yeah, there's just so many of them at a time for someone that could not see what's happening behind the scenes. And fast forward was that it came to a point where I thought there's something interesting to pursue here. So I started to by being obsessed about I got into the Flashbots Discord channel. At the time, there was not many people there, and I was like, I learned about this concept called MEV. and which sounded very interesting to me because I had friends in quant finance, and anytime you want to do anything in quant finance or like in traditional finance, like you need to come from the right university, you need to have access to the right circle, to capital, to the right infrastructure, and etc. So it was very interesting to see that, you know, an anon in the bedroom could do something if they write good code and maybe if they just give it a try. So spend 3 to 4 months just like, you know, learning whatever I needed to build one of these MEV bots, you know, starting with how to write smart contracts, how to learn how to work with the Ethereum client and reverse engineer it. Um, Learned quite a bit, had some failures, had some a bit of success at the end, but then what you realize in MEV is that alpha decays pretty quickly, and when it decays, you ask yourself, do I want to keep going through this roller coaster, or am I in for the tech? So I chose the second one, and through this like process of chasing the carrot called MEV, I actually learned, you know, pretty decent amount of things. I got my first full-time job at Gelato Network. Um, so at Gelato, I did a lot of things, you know, on the infrastructure and application layer. So you build these like off-chain automation network and relayers. I built quite a bit of smart contracts there as well. And yeah, so a lot of the ideas behind Valantis, they really came around during my time at Gelato, because even though my full-time job was more on the infrastructure for applications, you know, DeFi has always been my thing, you know, since the MEV days. You know, even at Gelato, I was reading Uniswap v3 code during my bedtime. There's always something about it that I found pretty cool. And yeah, so at some point, there was this team at Gelato that they built a product called GUni. So GUni is this early product on top of Uniswap v3 where you would make Uniswap v3 a lot more accessible, like, you know, having this fungible token that you can, you know, just degen around DeFi in the same way that you did with Uniswap v2 kind of thing. And this team became Arrakis Finance then, but it was interesting to see that although Uniswap v3 was super flexible at the time, it, you know, it certainly made a lot of things possible. I could already see it at the time that pretty much all cool strategies cannot be built from like the Uniswap v3 model. Like you need an extra level of free programmability that was just not there. It's just not possible from a monolithic one size fits all kind of framework. So yeah, just after a lot of thoughts about around Valantis, like just speaking with a few people in my network, I decided it was a good time to, you know, to join Nethermind, where the goal was kind of like to figure this out, to, you know, do the research, get the right people to build this what became like a modular exchange protocol. David has been there since day one. A lot of the team, I met them at Nethermind as well, and yeah, spun off last year, and I can dive more in a sec.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting actually. A lot of different spots there I think that we haven't heard too much of. I think reading Uniswap code in bed, you know, like almost like Instagram or TikTok on your phone, something like that. It's pretty fucking bullish if you ask me. Um, before we get into the fun stuff, um, Devin, I think, or maybe with both of you guys, I think the whole ethos behind exit liquidity really resonated. The tweet you put out the other day was, you know, made me feel really good, made my heart warm. But unfortunately, we have to dig into some of the PTSD back there. We have to get each of your best exit liquidity stories. When was your most memorable time of when you were exit liquidity in the space?
Let's talk about rugs. Yeah, definitely. I think probably it's kind of a joke, but I always say that the merge rug fee, because I put a lot of money into graphics cards. I have no idea why I was doing that. No, but that's just a joke. Yeah, I mean, kind of started doing a lot more stuff on chain again. I started watching crypto a lot more closely in 2020, but actually, I went and checked my transaction history yesterday, and like really, kind of 2021 is when I started getting very active. Um, Mostly just like making Uniswap swaps and things like this. And I made a good amount of money on like DeFi tokens, and slowly started to get a lot more degenerative of where I was going. Um, yeah, essentially bought the top a lot of times, but it all kind of like ended in me deciding very, mature of me, like, hey, I'm going to get out of the market. I'm going to go into stable coins. My stable coin of choice at the time was UST. So I liquidated literally everything. I was like scraping dust off of like NFTs that I was essentially a community member for. Before this, I kind of learned how to be a community member. Um, but yeah, I had put everything in the UST. I actually withdrew it all out of Anchor as well. And Osmosis had launched superfluid staking. So that was the only like non-UST asset I think I had at the time, and some Luna. So I put it all in like a UST, not all of it. I put a good amount into a UST Osmo pair, and I was like, I'm gonna try out the superfluid staking thing. Like, it sounds super sick. You like basically like the whole idea is like, oh, instead of like creating liquid derivatives of staking, like why don't you do all your DeFi stuff first and then stake it at the end? Like it makes more sense to have like this asset actually locked and secured, but it is backed, but you're getting all the DeFi yield that you wanted. I was like, oh, that's like a really good idea. I can only do an app chain, Osmosis app chain thesis. So I was just kind of like trying that out. I think it was like probably I locked the liquidity for like 2 weeks, which was the maximum period, probably like 2 or 3 days before the initial UST peg. So that was locked. All of the UST that I had still, like it was sitting on Terra. When the DPEG started happening, I think I was just like buried too deep. I maybe had like a couple $1,000s left that was like meant to like just college funds pretty much. All of that pretty much went away too. Basically, it got to the point where all the money that I had essentially gone to zero in UST. I then like took apart my PC and like sold all the parts and was like, okay, I'm not gonna gamble anymore. I'll make it through the rest of college. It was definitely necessary because the stakes still, the stakes were not that high at the time. But it's a good lesson of like, I don't know. I felt very, very. There's always the feeling of like you want to double down on your bets. So when you feel like you're a bit like already kind of invested in something, it's like, no, I'm going all in. Like no one can tell me I'm wrong. I'm going to be bullish when everyone else is bearish. And like that particular one did not end up paying off very well. I don't really even know what was kind of going on because I understood the Ponzinomics. Like I knew that the death spiral was possible. I just
Yep.
put a lot
was
of
the same way.
faith into one. I think.
Yeah. It was an interesting one for sure. Knowing it was going to happen and still like staring it in the face, being like, "Yeah, I can have 100% of my net worth in this thing."
I saw like deploying more capital lads, and I was like, okay, like
Yeah.
we're good, right?
I was like, "Hell yeah, yeah, he's got us." Ed, what about you, man?
As you can imagine, there has been quite a few because imagine like my entry point being close to the ETH all-time high, like 2021. So even with like my safest part of the portfolio, it has been quite a downride from then maybe until late last year. But the more interesting one, I think, it was like more of a technical one. But as I was trying to build these MEV bots, at least the first version, at the time I didn't know, but it's usually the things that you don't know that kill you in the end. But so basically, there was like a lot of other bots that they were setting like trapdoors for people like me, right? So basically, they would spin off these like random Uniswap pools with like shady tokens and mechanics, and it's done in a very clever way where basically what happens is the developer deploys these malicious tokens where they trick you in a sense where you think, okay, I'm just about to make a lot of money if I back run this trade or something like that, right? Because you simulated and you thought, okay, this will be the outcome. I'm gonna make like 2 ETH in this transaction and be so happy. But in reality, what happens is by the time that your transaction lands on chain, there's like some different code path that gets open that you didn't know. There's no way you could have known about it, which implies that your money will basically be locked forever. There's no way for you to withdraw it. So learn the hard lesson at a time. As someone who was trying to do something in MEV, then basically the lesson at a time was, okay, don't just ape into any background or sandwich from random tokens. Like maybe try and have more curated whitelist of things. The other one, like even before I learned how to code in smart contracts, is very simply these random coins where the dev will say, hey, look, the dev that deployed the token used to work at a X, Y, and Z famous DeFi protocol. You go on Telegram, everyone tries to pump the token, and then the dev rugs and they delete the Telegram group. It happened quite a few times.
No community takeovers in those?
No, not in these ones, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy I think that's probably our most technical exit liquidity moment reference we've had of just like these complex MEV bots, and getting the idea of getting attacked by something you can't even predict or see in code is just like that. Just sounds like probably the most dangerous world to live in. That's pretty interesting. Um, yeah, those are some good stories. Those are some good exit liquidity stories. I really like those. Jumping into Valantis, I want to start on kind of just the simple elevator pitch. You guys have probably done this a million times, but I'd be curious at how you kind of introduce people to Valantis.
Sure. So there's really two parts to it. One is like the high level vision in the core protocol. Why did we build this thing? And then it usually segues into more like the specific parts and how do we want to use this core protocol to build cool things on top. But like with Valantis itself, the pitch is kind of like you see this very repeatable pattern over like the past 5 or 6 years of DeFi, and that is a developer or a team, they have some sort of idea for a product that they call a protocol. They always start from the empty address, and in order to build something serious in the space based on like a smart contract, usually takes at least between 1 year to a year and a half, right? Because there's a lot of complexity to deal with. Then there's a lot of audit costs, go to market costs. You know, there's always something that never goes as planned during the process. It's quite time consuming.
I
I
think
think
you
we're
wrote.
losing them. Oh,
Oh,
Oh, he's back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so imagine what's like, in Web2 you have the luxury to move fast and break things. You wish you could get the same in Web3, right? And it will be better for you to get the same in Web3 because this is a much faster moving space, right? But it's the opposite because building anything based on smart contracts and high value applications, it adds so much inertia. So what happens is after the developers jump through these hoops to bring their product to mainnet, the market has just changed completely for them, right? So maybe the thing that they built is no longer has product market fit, or a competitor's built something similar or even better. So now they have to repeat the whole cycle and start from scratch. So the emphasis here is that probably for a lot of things, people shouldn't really start from scratch, right? You have pretty good developer libraries nowadays. If you want to deploy an NFT or an ERC20 token, you don't need to audit the contract. Just take open sampling libraries or like things that have been around for a long time. So Valantis tries to really answer the question by saying, okay, what if building, ex- on-chain exchanges didn't require developers to always start from scratch? And kind of like the only way to have a chance at tackling this question is by doing things in a modular way, because modular things means code becomes more usable, which is like one of the things that you need to realize this vision. You need to build the right foundation so that new things can be built with less code and also with better security. Because if you say something like, look, here's the empty address, you can build anything, you're not adding any value to developers. They still need to go through the same problems and pay a few 100K for audits. So yeah, the way it's done in Valantis is you can think about it as kind of like you know a decent foundation with like an app store on top. What I means exactly is you have these like liquidity pools that they're super flexible. They find the sweet spot between allowing developers to build anything on top, but at the same time providing something useful from the get-go, such that they never have to start from scratch. And the way developers go about making innovation happen is they either take existing modules that we already built, or they write their own modules. And because modules are like, there's 8 to 10 of them, each module in the system deals with a very particular feature of the exchange or like what you might be interested in the product. Then that means writing less code. It means kind of like, picking apart Lego blocks that fit together and never having to kind of like uh, to build your own house from scratch every time.
Interesting. I think. Do you have an example maybe of like kind of the life cycle of a developer from you mentioned kind of like 1 to 2 years of development, and there's a lot of kind of audits and a lot of money and time that goes into that. What would be the comparison for someone like doing all that from scratch versus kind of doing it where for Valantis or with Valantis? I don't have a good example of an innovative new DApp, but just imagine uh, some kind of EVM DEX. Maybe like a game that has like some DEX implementations inside of it.
Um, I think I can give you a concrete example based on like the first product that we brought into production. And so, the core protocol is one thing, like, it has been kind of like been solidified for a while now. And then we said, okay, now that we have the core protocol, we think we have a decent foundation. Let's actually put this claim to the test, and let's see. We had a specific AMM design. It's called hot AMM. I can dive a bit deeper later on. But then we said, okay, let's put this claim to test, and let's build this on Valantis, and let's see how long it takes and what are the benefits. So what happened was, when we built hot AMM, it actually took us less than 2 months to be like fully ready for an audit. So two months is a much shorter period than we as a team internally had in the past. Like, in the past we tried other things that took us at least 5 to 6 to even be polished enough to be ready for an audit. So 2 months was significant advantage, and it kind of like meant that the the we wrote about, I think, 1,500 lines of code instead of, and if we had done it from scratch, it would have been at least 2,500, maybe close to 3,000. And so yeah, like I would say, like, it saves you time, it saves you line of code, but also like once the modular system clicks in your brain, you it it has a lot of benefits because you can think that, okay, if I build this thing and I take everything else for granted, I know for a fact that X, Y, and Z crazy attack vectors will never happen in my module system. So that alone, that's part of the reason why it saves a lot of time, because maybe it saves you like 1 or 2 weeks of writing tests, for example, which tends to be quite good time consuming.
And then, so a major component of that is the sovereign pools, and you guys have a graphic in your docs that kind of walk through that um, process and how it interacts with all the other modules. Could you explain the pool in association with like the apps, the core protocol, and then hot AMM?
Sure. So the sovereign pool is like basically the part of the core protocol that is immutable, and by itself it's not very interesting, because it's just like a starting point for what is to come next. And attached to that pool, you have quite a few modules, as you might have seen in that diagram, right? So you just maybe like to walk you through what would happen in hot AMM or like something similar. Is, let's say you're a trader, you want to make a swap. You don't even need to know that you're coming through Valantis, but let's say that at some point someone needs to call the Valantis sovereign pool and say, hey, look, I wanna make a trade. Here's the minimum price that I require and like the basic terms of the exchange. And so what happens in this model architecture is, step one, and this is an optional step, by the way, is the pool is going to query what's called the verifier module. So the verifier module is relevant if the pool is, let's say, access restricted, like maybe has a component that says not everyone can swap on the same terms. So it just asks like, can this address swap? Can this address uh, is this address allowed to call this function in the pool and what conditions? But if your pool is permissionless, you don't need to worry about this. But that's like the very first step of the process. The next thing that happens is, uh, the you're going to query what's called the fee module of that is attached to a sovereign pool, and as the name says, it's going to dictate what is the fee that you should be paying, even before you go forward in this swap. So in most AMMs, like Uniswap v3, Uniswap v2, etc., it tends to be like a constant fee, like 0.3% or something along these lines. Here, it could be anything you want. So you could have dynamic fees, constant, whatever is needed for the use case. And finally, you get to the most interesting part, which is you need to you need to define the meaning of like pricing, right? You need to say that, okay, now that I've got this far, I've already I've already deducted my swap fee for the trader. What's the price that are you willing to give according to the AMM or like the RFQ or whatever logic it is? So now the pool calls the Valantis liquidity module, and that would be hot AMM. Hot AMM would have like a specific way of pricing the logic, but it could also be an order book, it could be an auction, could be something even more exotic, right? And through that process, a price is going to be determined. Uh, then you cross-check the price that you got with the one that the user requires. So, for example, if you wanted at least 1 ETH and you got 1.2 ETH, you're happy, you're good to go. But if the pricing model gives you 0.9, then you say this is not good for me. I want to cancel transaction right here, right? So then there's like a sequence of steps to just clean up everything and make sure that the modules have a chance to do their things. But that's kind of like the TLDR. It's like modules have a very well-defined role in the system, and because of that, you can add new features without breaking others. So, for example, if you want, let's say that today you have hot AMM or like Uniswap V2 style AMM, but then tomorrow you might say, oh, I don't want constant fees. I want to go from constant fees to dynamic fees to protect my LPs a bit better. You just change the fee module in the pool, and without altering any other code components nor having to re-audit stuff, you just live and good to go. That would be an
So,
example.
so just so I got this right, the sovereign pool is kind of like the framework itself that each kind of uh, app that's using Valantis taps into, or can they each have their own sovereign pool? Because I know there's mention on like mitigating liquidity fragmentation. So I'm curious if this is something that is meant to kind of like one sovereign pool to interact with all of the AMMs that are using a Valantis, or can they each have their own pool and then add structures or add modules around it?
Uh,
Yeah, so I mean, each pool when it's deployed is a deployment of the sovereign pool. Like it gets its own sovereign pool, and you define all of the modules. Like for particularly when we talk about shared liquidity, it means that individual sovereign pools share the same sovereign vault module, so they can actually share modules to have this kind of shared liquidity structures. But yeah, each pool itself exists as a deployment of the sovereign pool, and then you build all of the logic kind of around it. Um, and yeah, I mean, really, the point of this foundation is decoupled security. So it's being able to say, because hey, the verifier module is only allowed to, like, say if someone is allowed to access this pool or not, I could build whatever logic I want into the verifier module, and I could slap it on top of a Uniswap V2 style AMM. I could slap it on top of the hybrid order type. Um, I mean, like, I think like a pretty good example of like the usefulness for this is like HOT is like a hybrid dual execution system where it's like you can have your normal swaps that happen over the AMM, or you could have this somewhat kind of like special execution. Um, and like that infrastructure itself is just like there's two types of pricing, and that exists. That's audited. We know that kind of has its own security model. If you, I don't know, are building a game or something, you're like, hey, I want to have some structure where it's like my people that have a higher level on the game get like a higher discount on their swaps or something. They get like some special pricing. I mean, you could just put that, and maybe there's multiple games and there's multiple different games you're building, and you like want different logic for deciding what that discount someone should get. You could implement that as verifier module, and like the underlying pricing of saying like there's two types of swaps, there's the AMM, and then there's like this discounted still exists as itself, and like doesn't need to be re-audited, can just be reused. But now you just slap on this like verifier module that has the logic of like how do I want to compute each of these swaps, and like yeah, the idea is that like because it's so decoupled, you can just take whatever piece you want to change and plug it in and like not be worried. But yeah, each one gets its own sovereign pool that you build kind of everything around.
And so the sovereign pool feels like the important piece, or kind of like the light bulb kind of moment that or it's like the product from the light bulb moment that you guys kind of had on the problem itself. Um, what makes the sovereign pool like very secure and usable across all different AMMs? Like
um,
how would you describe the differences between other AMM structures and a sovereign pool framework?
It's so it depends on how you see it, but like, you know, part of the motivation for the sovereign pool itself, at least like the swap parts of it, is, you can look back at like 5 years worth of DeFi and AMMs, and there's always a familiar structure when it comes to like to the conditions to make a swap safe, or at least on the trader side. And those are basic things like enforce that the trader is getting the price that they ask for no matter what, otherwise you revert transaction, or things like enforce that it cannot interact with like an arbitrary token address that is not registered in the pool, or things like make sure there's a deadline so that your transaction is not lingering in the mempool forever, which could be sandwiched and like attacked in a crazy way if not done anything about it. So the sovereign pool really has all of these protections. So at the very least, it's kind of like a summary of what we've seen that works, and the emerging structure of DEX in the past few years. So that is there. And besides that, it depends on how you want to use it. But it one key role that it plays across the whole Valantis vision is that it glues all of these modules together in a very safe way. As in, you have about like 8 modules attached to the sovereign pool, and then um, part of the reason why you get a lot of security in the end is because the sovereign pool is very predictable as to how it calls these modules. As in, you have absolute guarantees that, for example, a verifier module, it should never ever be able to like steal funds from the pool in any way. Like, that it only gets called at like very specific parts of like a swap or a deposit or withdrawal, and that should not be surprising, right? Or for example, the fee module. You have 100% guarantees that, thanks to the way the sovereign pool is designed, it can only do only one thing, which is each time there's a swap, it can tell you what is the fee to charge. It cannot do anything else at all. So when you combine this interface, so to speak, with and calling them all the models in the right way, that's what gives you like basically the improved security guarantees. And at the same time, it's not surprising, because a lot of these patterns, you have seen it, in previous DeFi protocols. It's just that it hasn't been put together in a modular way yet.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I'm understanding it. There's basically, I like the comparison you made previously on uh if you're going to deploy an ERC20, like the base foundation has already been laid for that. You know what you're doing, and if you want to make tweaks to it, there's kind of ways to do that on your own, but you don't have to start from complete zero. So these sovereign pools kind of allow for that. Um, for the hot AMM and the modules baked into that, um, could you describe what modules are built on top of the sovereign pool for the hot AMM, and what makes it special?
Yeah. So like the kind of core idea of hot AMM reflects back to a couple different ideas. One is that basically the dexes as they exist are kind of being outcompeted by private market makers, and that's essentially like referring to a lot of ideas in like traditional finance that you find of like there's kind of this relationship that exists between market makers and brokers, where like some people continue to bring user facing flow that's considered non-toxic, so you can give these kind of strategic price improvements to them. And I think like with the rise of like these intent networks, like CalSwap, where traders are going in and essentially their orders are being auctioned off, which it's really kind of difficult you can't really run an arbitrage through these things. It's essentially retail flow. Private market makers recognize this, and they're essentially just able to outcompete dexes, because dexes are kind of like blind, deaf, and dumb to like who's trading on it. So they just have a single execution model where everyone kind of gets the same price, and they need to be like extremely protective, because they're like, I don't know if you're an arbitrager, I don't know, maybe you're a normal swapper, so I'm just going to give everyone like kind of a bad price and just hope that on average I do pretty good. So like being able to separate these two, I think, is a really important idea to allow dexes to be competitive in this like intent-based model where we're kind of moving. We have a lot of fear that essentially Wintermute and SCP will be the ones filling all of user orders unless someone builds some better infrastructure to allow on-chain LPs to still kind of participate in this game competitively. So yeah, when you actually break down hot AMM, it's the core liquidity module, which is the pricing logic, has two execution modes to it, has two separate tracks that a user can get quoted on. One is if they come in with a signed quote from like an off-chain RFQ, which these are mostly solvers that are trying to execute retail user orders. They can get filled directly, like very low gas or just kind of like direct filling. Not many concerns about like the capital efficiency of like they're just kind of filled directly at some quote that they were given off chain. And kind of the other piece to this is that if you come in without one of these pre-signed orders because you're not some entity that is like executing orders on CalSwap, you're just coming in directly, you're going to execute over the AMM, which is like what we traditionally think about in these is what we traditionally think about for DEXs. Yeah, and the kind of interesting piece here is that like AMMs are all the time like pretty much picked off from this latency arbitrage problem. They have still prices, especially if you don't have people trading on them very often. Like you come in and at the next block, like the price on Binance has changed by so much, and essentially these AMMs are again like not really able to see what's happening off chain. They're not able to see the real prices, so they're selling too low essentially. So like we kind of threw in this repriceable AMM model where basically we're able to bring in off-chain information to be able to shift the spot price of the AMM. And between when that's happening, we have this dynamic fee mechanism that's based on expected volatility of the assets. So it's basically saying like, yeah, Ethereum has like 12-second block times. Between the end of one block, the price of ETH was $1,000. At the next block, the price of ETH is $1,005. Like on Binance, the price has changed. But the AMM can't change price unless someone trades on it. So what usually happens is someone comes in and the first transaction is arbitraging that. And they're like, okay, well, I'm going to sell you ETH or I'm going to buy your ETH at $1,000 because the real price is 105. And so we kind of need to implement this dynamic spread mechanism where essentially like this is implemented as a fee module. Now as I'm talking about is a fee module says that, okay, based on whatever the volatility estimate is, as time goes between the last time my AMM spot price is updated, I'm going to increase the amount of fees that I charge because I need to protect myself from arbitrage. So, I mean, you can imagine this, like if the spot price of the AMM is $1,000, which again is the wrong price, well, the actual fee that's applied on top of it now makes it so it's $1,005, ideally, if the volatility estimate is working correctly. And what this does is this protects the AMM from being arbitraged. But as soon as the AMM spot price update lands in the pool, which just happens when a solver comes and executes their RFQ order, that spread is kind of essentially brought down as minimum as possible. And then everyone else can kind of come in and trade at very fair prices with low fees. There's kind of this theory that like fees and AMMs are supposed to be some proxy about how certain you are of what your price is. And if you're a normal AMM, you're pretty uncertain about your prices, especially between blocks. Like you need to be like, okay, no one's traded on me for 12 seconds. My price is probably stale. I need to have some large fee to protect myself. But when we actually bring in off-chain information to do the repricing, we're able to be more certain about what the price of the AMM should be. So we're able to bring that spread really low. The system, like kind of in production, what it looks like is solvers are kind of incentivized to land as top of the block as they can to be able to get their direct filling and reprice the AMM. Then everyone else can come and trade on at low fees. And you basically stop any arbitrageurs from trying to pay for the top of block by having this increased fee if they try to front run the solver.
Gotcha. And you mentioned like a little bit earlier that part of your concern or one of the concerns you have is that Wintermute or some other solver is going to have too much of a monopoly over an intense network or over some sort of AMM. How are you guys addressing that, or how does the hot AMM address that?
Yeah, I can take this one. So the way hot AMM addresses is because it decouples market making strategy from the source of capital. And so let's start with an example. So today what's happening a lot with the private market makers that we see is that capital gives them a huge advantage. And what I mean is basically, if they have their own liquidity, especially in large size, they can basically make like an off-chain deal with someone else and say, look, I'm going to give you this improved price, trade directly with me, and so it never lands on chain to the AMMs, to the LPs, to DeFi and like the broader vision, right? And so if we want to make some progress here, like we need to think that, okay, so part of the problem is that, you know, so having capital and liquidity gives market makers an edge, but what if you're able to commoditize the market making side a bit more? As in, what if you made a system where instead of forcing the market maker to have their own capital on hand, you say something like, any market maker that proves to be good at their job, they should be able to source liquidity from any retail LP on chain, from any DAO or like any permissionless entity. And that's what hot AMM does in a sense, because you know there's like this set of actions where you can make a market making strategy as sophisticated as you like. There's a very large degree of freedom on how you can code from these off-chain prices. You can do a lot of important actions on chain, like shifting the price range of the AMM, rebalancing the inventory to target some risk profile, etc. So it just becomes like a canvas for the right professional market maker to play with, right? But whenever the right market maker comes on board of the system, they they don't necessarily need their own capital, because one day the top talent for market as a market maker, they could come maybe to the Valantis DAO forum and say, look, I'm very good at market making, I work for XYZ firms, I have a track record, I know what I'm doing, but I just set up my own small firm, I don't have that much capital, maybe someone could deposit into this vault. And I'm like, if you can give me a small amount of capital, I'm going to show that I can like compete on the same terms with Wintermute, SCP, and others. So, but that's just really step one, is like decouple market making strategy from capital, and try and build a system where in the long run you enable more participants to come and compete with each other.
I think like Arrakis is always like really kind of important for this context because I mean they, you know, kind of developed the idea of decentralized like passive retail being able to run these complex strategies, and they were doing them over AMMs because like that's the on-chain infrastructure that we have. We're learning that AMMs have their issues. Even like with concentrated liquidity, like this idea of latency arbitrage, and there's one that just kind of shows like, okay, no matter what we do, like we're getting picked off. And still, I think that even then they're providing a pretty valuable new idea of like being able to have a sophisticated actor that's being managed by strict on-chain checks. So there's only they can manage your funds, but they can't rug you, or if they are, there's like some bounds about how unprofitable they could be. And yeah, they've been running these strategies on kind of these AMMs that have their issues that we know about. That makes it very difficult. But at the end of the day, like, I mean, yeah, it's difficult to write a V3 liquidity management bot, and it's not simple to develop these strategies. I'd much rather be a passive LP and just kind of like outsource it to them. And like watching as AMMs, like we realize AMMs have their issues, but at the same time, I think, yeah, AMMs are like DEXs as we know them today also kind of have a general inefficiency in being able to serve like a kind of growing intense market. We find that like, I mean, there's a lot of restraints even beyond price that are kind of applied onto these, onto winning like these auction competitions. Like you need to essentially be able to get your prices with extremely low latency. You need to have certainty that the price that you're getting is what's actually happening. So essentially like working with AMMs when you're dealing with like slippage is like not that easy. If you're doing something with like off-chain auctions and they take time, the latency, like it's just not that feasible to interface with. And what really scares us is the only RFQ like the only RFQs that exist are all private capital. So if you want to, tap into this game of being able to use RFQs to fill these user intent orders, which seems where stuff is going, you need a way to let passive OP still participate in that. Arrakis has like a lot of history with this, like the idea of decentralized market making, like liquidity managers. I think it has grown very large, but it's been kind of limited by traditional AMMs in general. This is, the next step in our opinion.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So I guess like democratizing the access to being able to be a participant in a solver network by kind of removing or lessening the capital barrier, I guess, that's necessary right now. To take like a quick step back to like the module approach itself, I think on paper it sounds, at least like the first comparisons that I drew were sort of to Uniswap v4 or like Ambient and hooks, or even like what Maverick v2 is doing right now as well. I'm wondering how the overall module approach kind of differs between what Valantis is doing and what we or what we're expecting to see with hooks and Uniswap v4.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty different approach. So TLDR about hooks is I think they make a lot of sense if if y- if you want to, let's say, look in Uniswap v4's case or maybe others, is like, they're very good at writing concentrated liquidity, right? Almost no one has done it right in the past few years. You've seen a lot of hacks whenever people try to build concentrated liquidity, and at least like for me, like the biggest value prop of UniV4 and similar protocols is that they say, look, we've audited these building blocks very well, concentrated liquidity. You can come and build a hook, which means you can like mix and match them to suit your needs without rewriting an AMM from scratch. And that's all good as long as the AMM that you want to build is within this like class of hooks where you can use the UniV3 maths and this kind of logic. But the moment you want to do something like more sophisticated, that like maybe it's not really XY equals K, maybe it's something more programmable or exotic, then you start to get less and less value from the singleton. Because at some point, like what was like a huge value add to you to giving you like these well audited primitives costed liquidity, you as a developer, you start to need to build around these constraints, and suddenly you ask yourself, why am I building on top of this centralized contract that is not adding as much value to me anymore? And I think that's really the biggest difference in how we see Valantis, because for us, we thought about more of an open system where, because we recognize that some use cases cannot be built within the singleton model. Like, for example, in a singleton model, you still have fragmented liquidity across pools or pairs, right? Because basically what happens with these hooks is that they need to register themselves in a central contract. They need to say, I have these two tokens, I have this amount of reserves that are pre-allocated to my pool. But we're really going towards a future where liquidity competition is only getting more fierce. So we probably should be thinking about things like, how could we securely share liquidity amongst like different protocols or even like DEX designs, right? So I would say really the biggest technical difference between hook-centric protocols and Valantis architecture is that we said, okay, instead of just forcing everyone to be, bound to a singleton, why don't we just make it a module? And that's the sovereign vault in Valantis. Because what we say here is these pools with their modules, they can choose from where they source liquidity. So in the example that I gave earlier, uh, the walkthrough was assuming that liquidity was stored in a sovereign pool itself, which is a way to do it in Valantis because it provides a lot of built-in feature for developers. But if you want to do things like shared liquidity, you could say something like these 10 different Valantis pools, they all share the same vault that is able to provide liquidity on request to any of them. So I would say one interesting example is like, for example, Sanctum on Solana. You cannot build Sanctum with hooks, but on Valantis it happens to be quite straightforward.
Yeah, I would also
Okay.
just kind of like Ed kind of like gave like I think a lot of the technical differences, but I think like philosophically, like how did we end up here with like kind of two different programmability layers of like hooks around concentrated liquidity and this like hyper generalized like modular approach. Um, yeah, I mean we are not a DEX team that has been building a DEX prior to this. We essentially kind of had a bunch of different ideas about what could be improvements on what exists today. And then we were like, how can we fit this all into the same model? Like, how can we build something where we can build all of this and not like need to reuse and be able to reuse as much code as possible? I think what happened with like V3 or V4, like ambient, kind of all of these new models is these were teams that were building around the existing primitives that they have that work and have a lot of value, and they have their use cases, and they were figuring out like, okay, how can we take what we already have and then add some layer of programmability to it? Whereas what we started with was we started with nothing, and they're like, how can we create a foundation where you could like rebuild anything possible that we would want on top of it? Which is why you find that like we didn't enshrine any pricing logic, because we were like, well, yeah, V3 concentrated liquidity, but like, I mean, what if there's other ways to implement it? What if we come up with like a more, gas efficient way to like implement concentrated liquidity somehow? Like we want the flexibility to be able to do this, and like, oh, maybe concentrated liquidity isn't actually useful for everything. So we started at the beginning, and just kind of every time we had a design decision, we were like, what if this is wrong? Like, can we stick it as a module? Like, what safety checks can we say that like anything can be implemented here? And you still get some amount of value from like the security checks with the core pool, but you can still, the world's your oyster. Like you can build anything. So I think just kind of like having to start from scratch, we ended up in a very different place because we weren't trying to work around existing models about how people think DEXs exist to work, which is mostly in the context of like concentrated liquidity AMMs. And even like people don't really think about like, does it actually matter where liquidity is stored? When we started thinking about like, is there a way for us to do it with multiple models, in pool, singleton, shared liquidity? You are like, okay, well, do we need to pick one? Like, is it necessary for us to pick one? Like, what can we add to security checks to say like we don't actually need to make a choice right now? We could just figure out whenever we want to build, we can make a choice. We can design it however we want, but we're still like sitting on some foundation that like means we're not starting over. We don't need to re-audit everything. That's really kind of like where it comes from, is we were just like, we don't have enough money to pay for all of these audits. How can we like make sure that if we come up with something new, we can build it as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible? And it's already like, even for us trying to build on the core protocol, I think it's already proved its value. With Hot AMM, Ed mentioned how quickly we were able to build it and like a lot of the properties we get around it. But yeah, I think it's going to continue to like be able to show that there's maybe these class of designs that aren't accommodated well in those models that you can rebuild here. And as the more modules get built, the App Store thesis, I think, is very true. The decoupled security is not something you strictly get with hooks. It's a bit more complicated to say like, I could just slap this hook on and I know for sure that it only does these things. But yeah, we have this kind of like core segmentation of security that I think as the ecosystem gets built out will show its merit a lot.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that definitely helps to differentiate there. I think it'll be interesting to see as developers come and build modules versus building hooks, and kind of how we see the different token launches, the different LP launches between those two. I want to circle back on something we talked about way earlier, which was governance. Devin, I know you have a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of interesting experience in that space. I'm wondering how you guys are kind of thinking about governing Valantis from an early stage. How are you hoping to kind of circumvent some of the problems you've seen in other DeFi protocols and come up with new solutions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Glad you asked it. Yeah, this isn't something that we've like spoken a lot about. I think like something that me and Ed had made pretty early agreements on is that we actually align very closely with the Cosmos thesis. And if you notice, like sovereign pool is kind of the sovereign chain kind of inspiration. Obviously, I mean, I think there's a lot of inefficiencies with the model, but the idea of like you should be able to build anything and it should be able to exist on its own if you wanted to. And this comes into things like we don't have an enshrined fee switch. Like you could come and build something on Valantis and like you don't have to pay taxes. Like there's no like central protocol that can come and tax any pool. It's open source software. It's an open protocol. It's permissionless to build on. You're not bowing down to governance. We aren't whitelisting modules that you can use. You can build any contract. So I think in general, like we would just like, we don't want to place restrictions, but at the same time, like we need some value that ties this whole thing together. I think like the fact that if someone comes and builds a module on Valantis and they're like, I'm not paying taxes, I'm doing my own thing, that actually does help the ecosystem because the modules can be used across all of these different pools. Kind of our philosophy is essentially every product that we're building, or like with Hot AMM, for example, like we are including fee switches that will be like controlled by centralized governance in the future, decentralized governance in the future. yeah, I don't want to dig too much into our stuff around like token economics and gauge designs. But yeah, it's the same thing where we came up with a bunch of different modules for like how should token incentive layers work and how should LPs be able to like get access to the protocol's tokens to be able to do governance and all this stuff. We've come up with some pretty complicated systems, but we were just like, don't want to make a decision, don't want to commit to anything. Let's make it a module so we can do it all and none at the same time. But yeah, a lot of interesting stuff coming around that. I think it's a mistake for DeFi protocols to put too many things in their contracts that require central governance to control or decentralized governance to control. You don't want too many parameters that are critical to the point of your protocol. We don't have any. You don't really need them for DEXs, but there may be some reasons why individual pools that are like community owned. This is kind of, again, saying that we're build out products that will be essentially controlled by decentralized governance. Those may have some like fee parameters that are adjustable by governance, things like this, but it's a very hard statement of like we're not doing that with everything. Like not everything is like kind of ties back to this one entity, and I think that's like pretty important in building DeFi. Yeah, I think a lot of people's like their governance models is less like we need this to control the DeFi protocol and we need this to bootstrap the ecosystem. I think we do live a lot closer on that side. Things like decentralized like bounty programs, people being able to come and build and like be able to get DAO liquidity that are seeded into their pools. This is a lot of things that we think about, but they're coming. We need to bootstrap the ecosystem before we have something to hand over, and I think that's really kind of what we're doing right now. But yeah, definitely a lot of exciting thoughts about what's coming when that pass off does happen.
Yeah, those are some interesting points. I think I'd be excited to hear more about what your governance looks like in the future. You guys seem to have like a good idea, and you guys are in a good headspace and already made some very important decisions when it comes to that I think a lot of people will align with. What do the next few months look like for Valantis? What are you guys' like top priorities? What can the people watching this do?
Yeah, we're coming up on a launch of the HOT Vault soon. So I mean, yeah, we have the HOT deployed with just kind of like private liquidity, testing out market making strategies, mostly on Arbitrum and mainnet right now. We are working on scaling stuff on the off-chain side to make sure that there's as much like aggregation of this solver flow that's coming through these intent networks as possible. Building up those order flow integrations is something that's kind of like happening over the next few weeks. Yeah, and really kind of the next big thing is when people can come, and there's kind of like two, I guess, big markers. This one is like when the Iraqis HOT vaults open, that's where like LPs can actually come and benefit from these strategies. And yeah, the second piece is when the Valantis core protocol is fully deployed with permissionless pool deployments. So at that point, anyone can come and deploy a pool and combine their modules. They could, like, again, HOT itself, also all the modules are open source. So you could come rebuild this thing and build your own liquidity management protocol on top of it if you wanted to. Anyone that wants to do that, definitely come talk to us, or any ideas that you have around cool modules, things that if like you're building a DeFi protocol and you're like, hey, I want this custom thing. We are like super friendly and open to all of this kind of like contact, and we always just like chatting about new ideas. There's so much to build. So
nice, yeah, cool stuff. Excited to see what gets built out. Excited to see how things progress there. I think we're a little bit over time here, so we can start to wrap up. But we really appreciate you guys taking the time. This is interesting stuff. We'll definitely be following along, seeing how things move along. I don't know if there's any closing remarks, any last calls to action you have for our audience here. But if not, we can go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, no calls to action for me, but definitely want to say thank you to you both. Like this is awesome. Like we really enjoy your format, and it's kind of nice to be able to tell our stories in this way.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was fun.
Yeah.
I actually understand what's going on now, so I appreciate it.
Makes me feel great.
Sweet. All right. Well, that was episode 80.